Welcome back to another explainer. Today we are going to dive into a question that sounds super simple at first, but is actually surprisingly complex and honestly fascinating. How exactly do we define popular culture? I mean, we all consume it, right? We talk about it every day. But here's the wild part. Academically speaking, popular culture is what's known as an empty conceptual category. Its meaning relies entirely on an absent other. Basically, it doesn't mean a single thing on its own until you contrast it against something else. So to figure this out, we're going to trace the clues from academic theory to historical catalysts across 5 sections: the mystery, culture and ideology, 6 definitions, industrial roots, and finally, context is everything. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the mystery. So cultural theorist John Storey points out something absolutely crucial here. He notes that popular culture is, in effect, an empty conceptual category, one that can be filled in a wide variety of often conflicting ways. The big takeaway? Pop culture isn't just a fixed list of chart-topping songs or blockbuster movies. It's literally an empty vessel. It's always defined, whether implicitly or explicitly, in contrast to other things, like high culture, mass culture, or folk culture. You literally cannot define it without looking at its shadow. Moving right along to section 2, culture and ideology. Now, before we can even evaluate definitions of popular culture, we really have to nail down the foundation of culture itself. The theorist Raymond Williams breaks culture down into 3 distinct steps: intellectual development, a particular way of life, and signifying practices. When we talk about popular culture, we're mainly mobilizing those last 2. We're looking at lived practices, things like taking a summer seaside holiday or celebrating Christmas, and we're looking at signifying texts like pop music, comic books, or soap operas. But we can't talk about culture without talking about ideology, which brings power and politics right into the mix. Academically, there are 5 different lenses of ideology we have to neutrally consider here. They range from just a systematic body of ideas held by a group, to the classic Marxist concept of false consciousness that conceals power relations, all the way over to Louis Althusser's idea of material practices, which is basically how our everyday rituals unconsciously bind us to a specific social order. And this brings us to a brilliant illustration of Roland Barthes's concept of ideology as myth. He argues that ideology operates mainly at the level of connotations, trying to pass off the cultural as natural. Our source text points out a really fascinating historical example of this. A 1990 Conservative Party broadcast in the UK tried to link the word socialism with imagery of red prison bars. The goal there was to unconsciously fix the connotations of the word, basically trying to make a very specific political bias feel like a natural universal fact, rather than something constructed. All right, let's get to the core of our investigation with section 3, 6 definitions. Historically, theorists have tried to pin down popular culture in 6 totally distinct ways, and they offer completely different angles. These range from a simple quantitative approach, literally just counting what is well-liked by a lot of people, to viewing it as a leftover inferior culture, a heavily commercialized mass culture, an authentic folk culture rising from the people, a negotiated terrain of hegemony, or finally a postmodern blur where all the old boundaries just completely dissolve. Let's zoom in on that second definition for a second: residual or leftover culture. This creates a really stark contrast. Think the popular press versus the quality press, or popular cinema versus art cinema. Under this specific lens, popular culture is simply whatever fails to meet the required standards of high culture. It reveals a really deep class and taste divide, where popular forms are basically deemed intrinsically inferior to exclusive art forms. But honestly, this rigid way of categorizing things shatters pretty quickly when you look at the real world. Take Luciano Pavarotti, for instance. In 1990, he took a Puccini aria to the absolute top of the UK charts and then played a free concert to 100,000 people in the pouring rain at Hyde Park. The tabloids absolutely loved it. The Sun even quoted a fan who said, "I can't afford to go to posh opera houses with toffs." It's a perfect example that proves the divide between high and popular culture is often way more economic than it is inherently cultural. Now, what about the third definition? The one that views popular culture purely as mass culture. This perspective sees it as this manipulative, commercialized, brain-numbing machine just consumed by passive audiences. But theorist John Fiske points out a staggering statistic that totally flips this. There's actually an 80 to 90% failure rate for new products. Most new films and records actually lose money. That massive failure rate radically undercuts the whole myth of the brain-numbed passive consumer. People are clearly actively discriminating in what they actually choose to engage with. Which brings us to the 5th definition, and honestly the one a lot of folks find the most compelling: Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony. This lens doesn't treat culture as something aggressively imposed from above, and it doesn't see it as spontaneously rising up from below either. Instead, it defines it as a compromise equilibrium. It's this constant, negotiated terrain of struggle between forces of dominant incorporation and subordinate resistance. Okay, let's step back into history for a minute. Section 4, Industrial Roots. So, having examined all the theoretical suspects, we really need to look at the historical origin story that made this conceptual category possible in the very first place. Before industrialization, Britain essentially had a shared common culture that lived right alongside a separate elite culture. But following the Industrial Revolution, 3 massive shifts happened over time. First, workplace relations shifted purely to a cash nexus. Second, the 19th century saw total residential class separation. The working classes started living entirely apart from their employers. And third, the post-French Revolution panic led to a massive suppression of political radicalism, effectively driving it underground. And the direct result of those massive historical shifts was profound. These forces essentially fractured Britain's shared common culture. And for the very first time, they birthed a distinct, entirely unmanaged space outside the paternalist control of the dominant classes. This created an exclusive space for a distinctly popular culture to actually thrive. And that completely set the stage for the modern cultural landscape that you and I know today. Which leads us perfectly into our final segment, Section 5. Context is everything. Here we are at the resolution of our mystery, where we discover exactly why that absent other we talked about at the very beginning matters so much. The absolutely crucial point here is that texts do not have intrinsic meanings. Their meaning relies entirely on context, the cotexts and intertexts that are woven around them. Just think about reading Bram Stoker's Dracula. If you read it today through the lens of modern feminism, it means something completely different than if you read it strictly within the historical context of its 1897 publication. Meaning is only ever a temporary fix. Take the Union Jack flag as a really powerful example. Depending entirely on the context, this exact same piece of fabric can signify imperialism over a colonial outpost, profound military honor when it's draped over a soldier's casket, or even right-wing politics when it's displayed at a political rally. Yet somehow, that very same design can also signify Cool Britannia for 90s mods and Britpop fans. It can represent immense national sporting achievement when wrapped around an athlete at the Olympics. Or it can symbolize active political opposition when it's burned abroad. The physical object itself doesn't change one bit. The context entirely dictates its cultural meaning. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. How do your own everyday viewing and listening habits actually shape the meaning of popular culture? Because if popular culture isn't just some fixed list of items you passively consume, then it is an actively contested site of meaning. And that means you, as a consumer and a participant, are actively helping to construct it every single day. Thanks for joining me to unpack this fascinating topic, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.